It's a great pleasure to be with you. Hopefully next time we will be in Berlin to be able also to enjoy Berlin. But anyway, this is a good way to interact with you. So let me actually go through, I will put my presentation in two parts. One is about the magnitude of the external shocks that Latin America has been experiencing. And then about the effects on economic activity. I conclude with in a very, I think, interesting way, because I will basically argue that more than the external shocks, what Latin America is experiencing is its own development problems that have to be overcome in the forthcoming future. So next slide. So I will first present the international context. Next slide. So the characteristics is, first of all, that the epidemic is, of course, the pandemic is, of course, a global phenomenon, but Latin America became the epicenter in June, August. Is now moving back into Europe and increasing again in the US. India has become more important, but this is a very important issue. I must say, difficult to understand exactly why Latin America was particularly affected. I guess the same question about Western Europe, by the way. Now, in the economic terms, the first is, of course, that we are experiencing the world's global crisis in the Great Depression. And the latest estimate by the IMF is a reduction of 4.7% of global GDP. There is also, or there was expectation that there will be a huge contraction of international trade, expected to be 13% according to the World Trade Organization. But the worst was in May with slightly under 20%, but it was followed by a very fast recovery, which actually has been China-led. We will see that graphically. Now, there's, of course, in that context, the fact that some services have actually collapsed in a significant way, particularly tourism and air travel. In terms of commodity prices, which are, of course, very important for Latin America, the only commodity prices that have really been negatively affected have been the energy prices, particularly oil and coal, and to some extent also gas. But other commodities have not been significantly affected. Beginning of the crisis, basic metals also were, but they actually recover with the Chinese when the Chinese pick up again. Now, remittances, again, there was a expectation of a very large decline in remittances, almost 20% according to the projections of the World Bank. But so far, the decline has been very small. Actually, according to ECLAC data, it was only 3.8% for the first semester, excluding Mexico. But if we include Mexico, there actually has been an increase in remittances. Next slide. So these are the graphs. This is the spread of the pandemic according to the Financial Times data that they publish daily. This was a few days ago. You can see here that Latin America at the top became the epicenter around June, but it had been declining. At the end, you see the rise again of Europe and India, but Latin America was the epicenter for about 3 months. Next slide. And in terms of the impacts of cases per million inhabitants, we are actually worse than Europe in many cases. Comparable to the United States, notably Argentina, Brazil, and Peru were strongly affected, but also Argentina and Colombia, despite the fact that they had a very early on significant lockdowns of the population. Next slide. Now, in terms of world trade, you can see here actually that there was a very strong decline in starting in March. Which was, about 20% in volume terms, but you can see that the recovery that has taken place is quite significant, and in a sense, we are not very far from the situation that was prior to the crisis. When you compare it with the 2008-2009 crisis, the recovery has actually been much faster than it was at that time. Next slide. And in terms of commodity prices, you can see in blue the decline of fuel prices, but not of non-fuel prices. Agricultural goods, for example, have actually been increasing in prices. So Latin America has not been affected either way. Actually, I don't have the slide here, but actually the recovery of Latin American trade is actually comparable or even faster than that showed in the previous slide about the world trade. Next slide. Now, in the case of capital flows, what we see here is actually quite interesting because there was actually initially a significant outflow of portfolio capital from emerging economies, actually one of the strongest or the strongest in history. But there was also a very rapid recovery of private capital flows. This, in my view, is associated to the Federal Reserve, the expansionary Federal Reserve policy, which generated actual recovery of financial indicators relatively soon in this crisis. And from mid-April, you can see we saw a recovery of bond financing in dollars, to some extent also in euros, but particularly in dollars. And 12 Latin American countries have actually benefited. And when you say that, well, that Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, and Ecuador are not subject to that recovery, you can say that almost all countries, except those four, have actually had access to the capital market, which has provided about $28 billion since since April, actually. Now, in contrast to that, multilateral financial support has been very small. We will see here in numbers, the only significant thing has been the emergency financing, which has reached a lot of Latin American countries, but those IMF trade lines are very small. It's among the quota of the IMF. So the most important have been the flexible trade lines, which is actually more like an insurance. It's a kind of overdraft facility that 4 Latin American countries have now: Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. But they have not disbursed that money. So it's only like an overdraft facility that they can use at one point. The World Bank has been increasing its financing, but according to my estimates, is lending Latin America less than what it did in 2009, 2010. And the two major development banks regional development banks of Latin America, the Inter-American and CAF, what is called the Development Bank of Latin America, actually don't have enough capital to increase significantly their lending. And finally, a good news was the renegotiations of Argentina and Ecuador debts in August. Anyway, this shows that private financing has been actually better than public sector financing during this crisis. Next slide. You see here the portfolio, the capital flows, the private capital flows. You can see the big flight from emerging markets in March, but also the recovery, particularly of hard currency bonds, which are the red bars, which actually became positive again in April and have been positive since then. You can see also that other bonds, which are basically local currencies, have also been positive since August and basically zero in the previous 2 months. So actually, huge contraction initially, but very rapid recovery. By the way, when you compare this with the previous crisis in 2008, 2009, it took about 12 months for capital markets to recover. Now here we see it was in 2 months, much faster than before. And the same thing is clear, next slide, in terms of the cost of financing. You can see here that there was an initial increase in the cost of financing, but it started to also to decline very strongly, so that now we have more or less, although there are fluctuations for months, days, etc. We have basically the cost of financing, which are very positive, and the recovery was much faster again than the previous crisis of 2009. Next slide. In contrast, you can see the IMF trade lines, excluding the flexible trade lines, which are not dispersed. The Western Hemisphere has only received about a bit less than $12 billion in credits. This is much less, again, than what is about 1/3 of what Latin America has been receiving through bond financing. Next slide. And in terms of banks, this is a historical feature, but just to show that the two major banks for Latin America are the Inter-American Development Bank and CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, which actually more than represent about 80% of financing. But these two institutions have not been capitalized, a very significant contrast with 2009, 2010, when they were capitalized. And if they are not capitalized, there will be a significant shortfall of multilateral debt. So also on the multilateral side, of development banks, the support has been relatively small. Next slide. So there are many uncertainties, but given time, let me actually move to the effects on Latin America. Next slide. So what is the expected performance of Latin America? Next slide. Now, Latin America actually, and this is very important, had been having a very bad quinquennium before this crisis. The period 2015-2019 was actually the worst quinquennium since World War II. Something I wrote early this year, I call it the lost half decade. And this is actually quite important because on top of that came the crisis. And the second quarter was very bad for many Latin American countries. The speed of recovery is, of course, uncertain. And so the region is actually competing with Western Europe and India as the worst performing regions of the world. By given the poor quinquennium that preceded the crisis, we are actually in the middle of a lost decade again. Which I describe as 2015-2024. Actually, could even be longer than a decade for the full recovery of per capita GDP. So next slide. You see here the worst quinquenniums, and you can see that the quinquennium, the last one in red, 2015-2019 were actually worse than the quinquennium at the beginning of the debt crisis of the 1980s and the quinquennium after the East Asian crisis. And then you have the contraction, which estimated by ECLAC, by CEPAL, is about 9% this year, which is, of course, the worst crisis in history, actually, for Latin America. Next slide. And this is the estimate for both of the ECLAC and the IMF. Actually, the IMF actually improved its projections recently, but we're talking about 8 to 9% contraction, with some differences across country. Venezuela, Peru, and Argentina, and Ecuador being the worst cases, but also Mexico being much worse than Brazil, for example. According to the IMF, and Colombia and Chile in an intermediate position. Next slide. The second quarter was terrible for most countries. You can see here that Argentina and Mexico were particularly hardly hit, followed by the other three economies. Peru is not here, but Peru was equally bad. So Argentina, Mexico, and Peru were the worst performing. Next slide. And just to compare, these are numbers that are comparable to the worst of Europe, which doesn't include Germany, but France, Italy, Spain, and United Kingdom show very comparable contractions during the second quarter. So again, Latin America competes in this regard with Western Europe and, in the previous slide, with India as the worst performing region. And this is next slide. This is shown in the estimates of the IMF. You can see here that Latin America will be contracting 8%, same as Western Europe, with India performing even worse with about 10%. Next slide. So on top of that, one problem that Latin America faced was that the fiscal space to adopt expansionary policies was very limited. This includes the fact that Latin America had actually a deficit, a primary deficit, that is after interest payments, which was worse than prior to the 2008 crisis. And in terms of debt, it was even worse. So the central government debt was 62% of GDP versus about 40% before the 2008 crisis. And for this reason, the capacity to respond with expansionary fiscal policies has been quite limited. Now, in terms of how much public spending has been taking place, of course, it's much less than developed countries. But Brazil, Chile, and Peru are the three countries that have increases spending most. The worst, as in the previous presentation, is Mexico, and Chile, and Colombia, and Argentina being, Argentina and Colombia have been in intermediate position. Now, the most important spendings are health and support for the poor and vulnerable households, a few employment subsidies, particularly Colombia. But on top of that, there are also credit lines and guarantees by the national development banks, which have been important in some other countries. Colombia, Uruguay, for example, are good examples of those benefits, which actually have been quite extensive in the case of Western Europe. Now, the outcomes in social terms are terrible. This was clear in the previous presentation, but I mean, in terms of employment, it has been terrible, but also in terms of poverty, where, according to the latest ECLAC estimates, will be going back a decade and a half back in terms of poverty reduction. Next slide. So you see here the very limited space in terms of fiscal policy. So there was a primary deficit of about 1% of GDP, and the total deficit on average about 3% of GDP, which contrasts quite heavily with the surplus that was characteristic before the 2008 crisis, and therefore Latin America could respond to the 2008-2009 crisis with expansionary fiscal policies. It was much harder during this crisis. Next slide. And in terms of poverty levels, poverty was already increasing in Latin America during what I call the last half decade, 2014-2019, but now it's expected to increase, close to 5 percentage points, which is about 45 million Latin Americans back in poverty. As you can see here, the poverty rate is going back to levels which were prior to 2008. So we have like 15 years of regression in terms of these social outcomes. Next slide. So what is my interpretation? My interpretation is that international shocks have been severe, of course, but actually not worse than in previous crises, actually even better. This is quite clear in terms of trade, in terms of remittances, and in terms of private financing. This crisis has been better, actually, for Latin America than the previous crisis. In contrast to that, there is a very weak international cooperation, but as I said, in many areas, the situation has actually been relatively good. So the poor economic performance of Latin America is remarkable and comes on top of one of the worst quinquennials in history. So my interpretation is that the major problems are national or regional, not necessarily those associated with international shock. And for those reasons, and I end with next slide. The agenda that a group of us have called the Latin American Consensus 2020, and it includes basically 5 basic areas for Latin America to go forward. The first one is a very ambitious active social policies, particularly because we need to reverse the deterioration in employment, in poverty, and also the rising inequality that has characterized this crisis. Now, second, we need to grow more. I mean, to have a strong recovery of economic activity. And that will not take place with the model that we were having before the crisis. And therefore, there is a need for a significant change in economic policies. And for that group, the one that drafted this Latin American Consensus 2020, our view is that there has to be a more active production sector policies with a strong science and technology policy at the center. The third one is that we have to improve a macroeconomic policy, which in a sense has some virtues over the past decade, but there are two issues that are quite important and have not been done correctly. The first one is that we need more countercyclical macroeconomic policies. So we cannot enter another crisis like this one without the capacity to do expansionary policies, fiscal policies in particular. So we have to move into a more active countercyclical policies. But also we need a more active tax policy with two elements. First of all, more redistributive tax policies, and second, more revenues in order to fund social policies. So that is the first element of this proposal. Fourth, we need to advance in international commitments, and I mentioned here first of all the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the global environmental agreements on climate change and biodiversity, in particular for Latin America, and a big push in regional integration, which in my view requires a depoliticization of the integration processes of Latin America. And finally, and last but not least, a strong commitment to democratic institutions. There are some countries that show a reversal in that regard, and some others in which political polarization, is actually also weakening our democratic institutions. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I went over my time.